Welcome to the very first installment of New York No-Go webinar series. New York No-Go represents the very best in strategic know-how, tactics, and networking for retail media. Each webinar will have its own specific focus. So whether you're a brand looking for advice on assortment strategy or a retailer struggling to monetize your site, you'll find crucial insights along the way. Today's session is regulatory compliance in retail media, the do's and don'ts. And I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Lydia Parnes. Lydia, former director of Bureau of Consumer Protection, is a partner at Wilson Sonsini Goodrich Rosati, a co-leader of the firm's privacy and cybersecurity practice. As a director of the BCP, Lydia oversaw privacy and data security enforcement efforts, developing approach to online advertising, including regulating on-site monetization. And alongside her is Andreas Reifen. Andreas is the CEO and strategic leader at Crelytics, a multinational performance advertising agency and a technology firm. He is a sought-after speaker, a published expert on the intersection of paid advertising, measurement, and retail media. I know they're both terribly excited for this session, as am I. So Andreas and Lydia, let's get started.
All right, welcome Lydia. I'm actually quite excited to have you on this webinar because usually it's just my industry peers, people who share the same mindset. I haven't ever had any lawyer on my call, but there's on my webinar, but there's a very good reason. So when I started in retail, probably around about 12 years ago, retailers were actually retailers, means they bought products and they sold these products, and that was it. Over time, they all started to reinvent themselves, and they became marketplaces or platforms and advertising companies. And the new game which is on the rise is retail media. So basically now all these former retailers, they now start selling ads on their sites, and we work with dozens of different retailers and have realized, I personally have realized, that there seems to be a lot of confusion about legal aspects of all that play. And some retailers believe they have to be very careful and everything that is paid needs to be flagged. Others just don't do it and don't flag anything. And it seems that nobody really knows what the legal obligations are here. And before we come to my first question, let's maybe just make sure that we are all on the same page. And I'm sharing my screen here quickly. We see a search page on walmart.com for washing detergent. So what you see on the top, that's a paid ad. It's, as we can see, it's not flagged here, but there is someone who's paying for it. And if I don't even have to scroll down, this first product you see here says in tiny letters sponsored products, and then we go down here, we have also sponsored products in the grid. So and apparently these are then being flagged by Walmart. So all these, while these are just products you can buy, someone promoted them, means that they might not have been shown, at least not at the same position where they are featured today. Maybe they would have been hidden on the second page or something, and now these products surface. And it's clear that this drives visibility, so brands are keen to gain more visibility and they engage in that advertising play and push their products to the top. So this is kind of where we are at today. And I'm curious, Lydia, what legal foundation we have coming from the FTC probably around all the retail media related aspects.
So, Andreas, thank you so much for inviting me. And I didn't realize that I was the first lawyer to participate in this. I'm very honored, and I'm actually not surprised that much, because, as you know, these are incredibly they're complicated issues, and I think that there is kind of confusion and uncertainty for a good reason. I will just say also very interesting to hear, kind of you talk about the change in retail over the past years that you've been in this industry. I've been at Wilson for 12 years, focusing primarily on privacy and data security. And early on, I said to kind of clients who were consumer facing, selling product, the data that you are collecting will soon be one of your key assets. And that has really come to be true. So, kind of very interesting developments in this space. Okay, turning to your question about what's the legal authority, and it is a great place to start. So the regulator that is kind of active in this space is the Federal Trade Commission. That's where, as you noted, I spent most of my career, and there is a section of the FTC Act, Section 5, that prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. That is essentially what the Commission relies on in its enforcement actions in the consumer protection area, as well as the policy guidance that it issues. And the FTC has further defined deception as a practice or omission that's likely to mislead consumers acting reasonably under the circumstances. And that this has been kind of the standard that the Commission has applied, the law that it's applied for decades. It's relied on kind of this characterization of what is a deceptive practice. So in this space, a very relevant piece of guidance are the search engine letters that were issued by the FTC. The first one was issued in 2002, and then it was updated by the Commission in 2013. So, the purpose of this guidance initially in 2002 was to address a change that had occurred in search engines. Initially, when these were made available to your kind of average consumer, search engines pretty much delivered organic results. These were natural results. People were asking, questions that were not commercial in nature. And the results that were being served in response to these queries were non-commercial answers. It was kind of like, an online encyclopedia. Ask a question and get the best answer to your question. And then the internet, back in, kind of like the late 90s, the early 2000s, became a commercial, another commercial channel. And as the internet moved to commercialization, so did search engines. And there was a development where there were some search results that were paid for. They weren't organic, natural results. And the Commission's concern back in 2002, they saw that search engines some of them were giving some indication that there may be that there may have been a commercial relationship. Others weren't. They were using all kinds of different signals. The commission felt that there was just going to be a bunch of consumer confusion, potentially leading to deception. And so they issued that 2002 guidance and said, if there's a commercial relationship, you need to indicate that there is that relationship, and you should do it by some disclosure that there is that this is an ad. Most, and all search engines did that. Over the years, they changed the nature of the disclosure. Some search engines indicated that there was sponsorship. Others still used the ad terminology. Some provided shading when there was a sponsored relationship, a commercial relationship. But at the end of the day, the commission felt that there was still a lot of confusion for consumers. So they issued their 2013 guidance to provide additional clarity. And that's really kind of that's really where the law stands today.
I think the 2013 letter also came because the FTC probably had realized that many people are just not aware that even though this was already flagged, they were just unaware that they were still clicking on ads. And as we've been in that business, Google ads, for quite some time, if you ask people, friends, family, they will all say, I've never clicked on an ad. And that's just because they don't know that these initial search results are ads, and nobody actually reads the content. So they still click on it and probably believe it's organic.
Right. I think there's certainly a concern about that. Yes.
Yeah. So thanks, Lydia, for laying this out a little bit. So the first question I would have is, does a retailer, let's say, and we can certainly also differentiate between, let's say, some small gift store or something which features maybe 150 products versus an Amazon or Walmart. Do retailers qualify as search engines? Because that's, from what I understand with my very basic legal knowledge, that's the critical aspect here. Does the letter to the search engines somehow apply now to retailers which are morphing into something slightly different?
Sure. So I think it is a super interesting question, and I think it's a difficult one to answer, which is why there's confusion in this space. So, I think you need to start by looking at the brick and mortar world. When I think we would all agree that shoppers who walk into a brick and mortar store, whether it is a small local retailer or a big national chain, they understand that they are walking into, a commercial environment. And they understand that when they're purchasing a product, some of the money goes to the retailer and some of the money goes to the seller of the product. And and there's no tag on each product that explains that there is some kind of a divvying up of the money that comes from the consumer. I think, and that I think we would all agree that would be absurd. But back in the day, and it feels as if it's a very long time ago, when you would go into kind of brick and mortar stores, there are retailers that would showcase certain brands. And it's, it is very possible and very likely that those brands might have been showcased in specific locations that got a lot of consumer traffic because of a commercial relationship between the seller and the retailer. Very common also in the grocery space, where it's very common for companies to pay for shelf space at the eye level. Again,
if I can quickly jump in here, because
sure.
I'd like to make the connection to what we have today online, because what you described, Lydia, is precisely the same thing that is happening online as well. And let's connect the two things. So the first one you described is, it's clear to any consumer who goes into a grocery store, any sort of physical brick and mortar store, that there is the retailer who makes money and that there is the brand who makes money. And I assume that most people would also understand that the best products are put into the top areas which are most visible, and without having an explicit commercial agreement on this. And this is the equivalent to having a ranking algorithm for any sort of online store. What these ranking algorithms usually do, they place products based upon, let's say, a profit per click. So an expected profit per click means a top seller would automatically get to a higher ranking than some other lame product which doesn't convert or has low margins and so on. So we already have factored commercial attributes into the ranking, which is basically the same as where do you put your product in the grocery store. And the second one, which you mentioned, traditionally all the CPG brands, they have side agreements. So Procter & Gamble products, you won't find them at the bottom of the shelf. They put them in the most visible field. Do consumers know that? Certainly, most people don't know that. Is it deceptive? It's hard to argue because all products are there, and you could also argue, yeah, I mean, it's the simple matter of the retailer, how he wants to get his products across and how he populates his storefront and so on. So what is the equivalent to this? That's the sponsored products play, where basically you buy online shelf space. Yeah, I want to be visible, so please put me on top of the page. So these are all concepts which are well known and which have been around for probably hundreds of years.
Right. So, all really good points. Here's one way of thinking about it. So I think it would be I think it would be a mistake, and I don't speak for the regulator. I don't speak for the commission, even though I used to be there, but I'm not. But it would be a mistake to look at retailers as if they were search engines. But I can see a situation, and let's, kind of go back to the example that you provided. So there was that banner ad for Tide that came up on top. To me, that looks like an ad. And it is, it looks like a banner ad that you may see anywhere. It has marketing claims in it. The brand is very prominently displayed. And I think that most consumers are used to seeing banner ads online, in whatever context. So the fact that there is no specific disclosure there, that makes sense to me. Now, when you were talking about this, one of the things that you said is that maybe some of these sponsored products were appearing on the first page solely because they were sponsored. I think it is. I think it is that may not matter, but I think what, in terms of, is that a problem? But I think what might make it, so let me step back for a moment. If you are surfacing products that are otherwise responsive to the consumer's query, detergent, and you're selling, 200 detergents, all responsive, all equally responsive, and somebody is just paying to be at the top of the list, that seems very much like what you see in the brick and mortar context. Very much like that. And I think that there's a pretty reasonable argument that you don't need a disclosure there. If, however, the consumer searches for, let's say, a washing machine with a specific feature, and what you respond with are, a whole bunch of products that have that feature, and also some sponsored washing machines that may not have that feature. And so they're appearing, they may not be entirely responsive to the consumer's query. I would say it makes sense there to provide some type of disclosure. There's an argument that a disclosure that is being served up as a response because of a commercial relationship. I could see an argument that in that context, a disclosure would be appropriate.
I'm chiming in here. I think this is something which happens all the time in organic search as well, and simply because of technical limitations of the algorithms, which might not understand that, I don't know, a product pops up for the search green. The product isn't green, but has a tiny little green lace or whatever, and then it shows up. So there are limitations, but I think generally I get your point. Maybe let's construct another example. What if someone let's say, types in washing machine reviews, and the retailer has a dedicated page listing the best washing machines for that query, and then instead of listing them in a non-biased way, they just put the one who pays most on top of that page. In this case, it's not about product purchases, that's an information query. And this should be non-biased information, right?
Yes, and raises a whole different set of issues that you could have. We could have an entirely separate discussion about this, about reviews, and when reviews are paid, what kinds of disclosures need to be surfaced then. But yes, in that context, I think it would be important to explain that you're surfacing a review because there is some material connection, is how the Commission speaks about that in the review context.
Lydia, at the beginning, you mentioned the FTC policy issued in 1983 on deceptive advertising. Could you give us some more insights? What is this exactly about?
Right. So, I think the purpose of that. This was a policy statement that was issued, I think it was back in 1983. And there was not a lot of clarity about what it meant to make a statement that was misleading or deceptive. You know, who should be, who were we, who was it, who would be deceived? Was it the reasonable person? Was it any claim that you made? What about puffery? Certainly a lot of advertising is about the best, tastes great, I love it. Are those claims that needed to be kind of specifically supported by advertisers? And so the idea here was to give some clarity to the advertising industry that the commission was going to focus on claims that were material to consumers, that would in some way influence their decision to purchase product, and only if a reasonable consumer would likely be misled.
So it seems we're kind of also getting back to that initial point, the letter to the search engines. And we had raised the question already, is a retailer now a search engine, or is it rather like the traditional retail store? Just from my perspective, how I would personally perceive this, if I go to a search engine, what I usually do is retrieve information. Then at some point, Google started factoring the more commercial aspects in, and now it kind of became some sort of shopping platform as well. But the huge difference to me seems, the retailer might be a product search engine, means nothing else than it's a fully commercial thing. Like everything you search is going to be paid. There won't be any sort of information. Even on Amazon, you don't retrieve information. You get products you can actually buy. So to me, it seems that this is a fundamental difference because, let's take the store example again. If I go into a store, I would expect that whatever I see is commercially motivated. I know I'm going to buy something, someone else is going to sell something. So I think that's how I would perceive the huge difference. Am I on the right track here, or how would you see that?
Yeah, no, I do think you're on the right track. And I think that when you're talking about areas where there's, there's it's a gray area, but I think that there is a very reasonable argument that that retailers online, in the first instance, should be treated the same way that they are offline, and kind of understanding that consumers certainly should not be surprised to understand that there are there are commercial relationships. I think where it becomes more uncertain to me is that my guess is that the commercial relationships in the online context are more they're more varied than they were in the brick and mortar context. And there is also, as you mentioned, online retail is changing. And in some instances, retailers are also providing organic results, if you will, information about products. And I think to the extent that there is a commercial relationship where it might not be expected, I think that's what you need to think about. Is there some something here that is different and that would be a surprise to consumers?
Generally, Lydia, from what I can conclude, based on our conversation we're having right now, it seems that there is no specific, dedicated, clear guidance. We rather have to look what the motivation actually is, what the FTC tries to accomplish. And from what I understand, it's protect the consumer and make sure that they are not being misled, that you don't omit information, and that that they can still make reasonable decisions which are not and don't let themselves mislead.
Always good advice. And I think that is absolutely right. And I think when we're thinking about hard questions, that's what we think about. Would your average person likely be misled by this?
So I also, maybe one question which is important, we might have some larger companies attending and some smaller companies attending. I would assume, but you can tell me if that assumption is correct, that if you are in a somewhat market dominating position, let's say you're Amazon, it's probably way more likely that the FTC will take a closer look at what you're doing. If you are the small gift store, I would assume nobody would really now pay too much attention. Is that the case, or are small companies at the same, do they face the same risk as the big guys?
So, also really good question. I think, like between those two extremes, certainly a very small local store that has gone online is less likely to face an extreme action by the commission. And as we all know, anybody who reads the newspaper and folks who are certainly involved in the industry, big tech and big generally is under extraordinary scrutiny by the government these days. So yes, I would say larger companies are more likely to find themselves questioned if there's a problem. And I would also say, some medium-sized companies could as well.
Let's assume someone has some significant size, wants to be on the safe side. There are also different shades of gray, so you can decide to not flag anything and just leave it all as it was organic, or you can decide to actually label every single product. Would it be okay, in your opinion, to just have a single disclaimer somewhere on the page? Could be, as Google does it in search, on the top right, saying sponsored, or mouse over. Could be some products might be sponsored, others are not. Just a general disclaimer, because the reality is we have side agreements, merchants with the sellers from the brand. Sometimes they just put products on top of the page. There is no cost per click mechanism, no programmatic buying, but there's still a side agreement. Then you have things like eBay has a concept called floating ads. So products might just move up a little bit in the grid, but they are not fully sponsored, just a little bit. So it means that there are lots of shades of gray. So instead of flagging every single product, would it be fine to have a single disclaimer? And would this get companies to the safe side?
Yeah, so that's an interesting idea, and I could certainly see that as a reasonable approach, particularly if you've got different products where that are being displayed. And as you know, there may be a variety of different commercial relationships. And none of this is necessarily apparent. These may all be a little bit unusual. If you have kind of different disclosures for a handful of products that are displayed in response to a consumer's query, it can become, honestly, it can become confusing. And sometimes too much information leads to consumer confusion and really no clarity. So if you have kind of one disclosure on the page, which explains generally there are, we retailer have different commercial relationships and may get paid based on different agreements. That would seem to be, that would seem to provide consumers with good information. I could see that as very defensible.
Lydia, my last question for today is, I mean, you seem to come from the FTC. You probably have colleagues who went over from Wilson Sonsini to the FTC. So you seem to become pretty well connected there. My first question is there any possibility to get specific guidance upon request? Or what other ways, or how would you usually engage with clients who have questions we are addressing here in the webinar? What value can you from the legal side provide? How would you approach this topic in general?
Yeah, it is difficult to get guidance from the commission. They are always kind of, they're very concerned that maybe they're answering a question and their response may be misinterpreted. It may be applied in a way that that they didn't intend it to. And then if they want to bring an enforcement action, the company says, well, but we did exactly what you told us. So they don't want to be stuck in that position. I will say, we have come up, I have a few colleagues on our privacy team who have come from the FTC as well. We, all have, kind of close relationships with folks who we used to work with. And on occasion, when we've been presented with an incredibly novel issue, we've gone to our former colleagues and said, have you thought of this? And for the most part, what we hear back is, no, we haven't. That is like a really new issue. So, so I think that, industry, not surprisingly, tends to be ahead of what the regulators are thinking about. On the other side, how do we deal with those questions when we can't get, there are no clear answers? I think what we do is we try and, the companies that we're working with, we try and really understand what their business goals are, what they're trying to achieve. If the proposal is kind of, you can't do this, we try and work with them to find a solution that meets their business needs. And I would say more generally, because we collectively have so many years of experience with the FTC, we have a pretty good sense of where they'll come out on issues, even when they haven't thought about them yet. And so, we're able to help our clients navigate the regulatory risks just based on that experience.
Would you expect the FTC to release more dedicated, specific guidance in relation to retail media? Because it's a high growth area. Amazon is making 20 billion a year. There was a recent Goldman Sachs report. So everyone is hopping onto this topic. So it's gonna get way more relevant than it has been in the past.
Right. So, again, hard to answer whether they will provide specific guidance in this area. I will say, as a general matter, kind of, even though you and folks in the industry are kind of trying to address a gray area, sometimes it's better not to have that specific guidance that may be more prescriptive. It's it's not entirely clear what they'll do. The agency frequently comes a few years later. So as there are more reports of big developments in retail, and retail is not moving offline, there will only be additional growth there. So it is entirely possible that some years down the road, they may look at all of the guidance that they've provided generally about online advertising and search, and kind of apply that in the retail context.
So Lydia, it's a point landing. We had planned 45 minutes. We're at 43 and wanted to allow the audience to ask questions as well. From my side, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed our prep call. I really appreciate the knowledge you've been sharing. So yeah, thanks for being with me on this webinar, and was great to have my first lawyer here on my session.
A pleasure.
Sumita, maybe you have questions.
Yes, there was this one question that came up, Lydia. With over 80% of Amazon's page dedicated to advertising, how do you see the government stepping into curbing their power?
Well, I think, as I indicated, I think there are real questions about whether and when the agencies will focus on retail specifically. But I think it is no secret that that not on the consumer protection side, but on the antitrust side, big tech is certainly under scrutiny, both by the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department. So I think that that those issues are being addressed on the antitrust side, and I would expect, some decisions from the regulators there within the next few years. Those will be slow and certainly cumbersome investigations.
All right, Sumita, I guess you don't have any further questions. I would encourage everyone who has questions to probably approach Lydia directly after the call. You will be able, with a few Google searches, to find Wilson Sonsini, and I'm sure Lydia is happy to answer some of your questions or get in touch with you if you have, if that's a matter you want to dig into. In this specific case, while I'm usually happy to answer questions, I'm probably not the right person with my rather limited legal knowledge. But again, thanks, Lydia. Thanks, everyone, for listening in, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.